work a little bit differently with a historic district, but it's whatever the consent requirements are for that historic district are also up to the community. So you can write it up to a 50+1 vote or a 2/3 vote for the buildings involved within the proposed district, or you could just designate them all individually.
Yeah, so the way most historic designations work is there are separate provisions for individual versus districts. Individual properties usually have to meet a higher standard in terms of why they're important, when you're doing the designation, not in terms of regulation or anything like that. So most local historic preservation ordinances will lay this out in the text of the ordinances passed by the community. So an ideal ordinance will clearly state the purpose of the ordinance, the reason why the community is adopting historic preservation. It will usually set up a board that's responsible for reviewing things like the applications for historic designation, and if you choose to have a form of design review for those properties that have been designated, so it would only apply to those properties that have chosen to be historically designated. The board would be responsible for reviewing that. Usually there'll be a staff person at the city that is tasked for staffing the board and helping them with the administrative portions of it. And then the ordinance will clearly state, well, these are our criteria for something to be historic. And they'll lay out what they expect to see in terms of an individual property and in terms of a historic district. They'll lay out the process for doing that. Usually in many other communities, the closest example to here, well, Citrus County is a certified local government. There's a county-wide historic preservation ordinance. And there person who applies has to submit an application, they have to meet certain criteria in regards to the age of their property and the story that's associated with the property, and the community can set those criteria. If you want to participate in our certified local government program, we do have a minimum requirement in terms of what those criteria should be. Usually properties should be at least 50 years of age or older. They should be associated with a historically significant event, person, or architectural style. And they should preserve physical aspects that connected to that story. Where they should be in relatively the same location. Their setting should be similar. They should retain significant portions of their design and historic materials. All of those criteria will be in the ordinance, and that will be something that you all craft as a community. And then they'll lay out the process where application, review, owner consent. So owner consent is the default. It is very rare in the state of Florida, and it's limited to only the largest cities way down south where people can do designations without necessarily the owner's consent. No area up here in this portion of the state has that, and we do not recommend it because we think that it is absolutely necessary to have the property owners buy into any form of historic designation. Same thing with historic districts. Historic districts, we usually set a percentage of the owners. A majority of the owners should be buying into that district. We don't set it at 100% because a lot of times it's not possible to get a response from 100% of the property owners for various reasons. We're running into that problem with another community in northeastern Florida where they're trying to do a historic district for their residents, but they have a lot of absentee property owners that have not responded to official communication from the city. And because of that reason, they're below their response rate, so they're unable to move forwards with a district that the people who are actually in the town, who own the properties or use the properties, support. So that's something to think about when you're crafting an ordinance. We don't have a minimum requirement necessarily in terms of the percentages outside of saying a majority of property owners should be.
It's up
Yeah.
to you.
Let me just follow up on that a little bit. So to qualify for the benefit of being a historic building or structure, you have to either be on the National Register of Historic Places, which is almost impossible for buildings in this town. It's very difficult, and everybody would sort of have to pursue it on their own. Or if there's a federally certified state program, which I don't think we have, where the state can designate. So as a practical matter, I think the only way for structures in this area to qualify as historic is for us to go through the process with the division of becoming a certified local government.
Yes, sir.
Randy Chubb, Yankeetown. I guess, I don't want to get into the weeds on this too much now, but, you touched on it briefly about the town's ordinance being crafted. Specifically, I'm interested in a design criteria package for specific architectural elements on structures. That we need to follow. Does the state have guidelines on that? For example, I designed a few houses in Hyde Park in Tampa. They have a huge historical commission down there. I'm sure you're aware of it, right?
Yeah.
They had specific guidelines for the architectural elements of the structures that they were trying to emulate or replace. Did they put that design criteria package together themselves, and are we responsible for doing that?
You won't necessarily be responsible for doing that, although I would caveat that with saying that that would be extremely beneficial for the community after your ordinance is instated. Reason for that being is,
Interpretation.
yeah, it really helps not only, homeowners know what is important about their building, what defines the architectural style of the building, but it's also helpful for the entire community, the commission, the historic review board, and the public to be on the same page about why this building is important for its particular style. And that way, when homeowners want to make updates or want to make improvements, that they can refer to those standards in your specific guidelines. So you make them with your community in mind, so highly specific. That way they can refer to it and be like, okay, this is too far, or this change is okay. And it really helps streamline the process a little bit, so it eliminates any confusion that homeowners may have.
Addressing finishes and fenestrations.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
Right, and
Right.
my reason for that, and I agree with that. I think that's very important because we've got to stop. I won't say stop, but we have to pay attention to, misinterpretations.
Right.
And that sort of defines it more accurately. So anyway, that's what I was curious about. And you answered that's something we really need to.
Yeah, usually what happens is the community will decide to do an ordinance, and then they do a survey of their community to identify, well, what would be historic potentially. A survey doesn't do a designation, it collects the information so that people know what buildings are there. And then based upon that survey, they use that information to also guide the preparation of those illustrated guidelines, so that the property owner who wants to do work on their property, you can give them that guideline and they can see very clearly what is allowed, what is not recommended, and that forms the basis for the review and the negotiation that involves those listed properties that would be subject to the design guidelines. We have examples from communities across the state. There are 80 communities currently in our Certified Local Governments program, and they're constantly revising and updating those, and we can provide examples of them, of how various communities do design guidelines and design review for those designated properties.
Two questions, excuse me.
Okay.
The first is the age of the structure. You mentioned 50 years and older. Is that a standard? So, because I was always thinking in terms of historic structures being 75 years, 100 years.
So,
So if 50 years and older is a legitimate designation, if we put that in the ordinance.
yeah, at the state and federal level, that's the baseline that we use.
But in fact, I believe that you could actually go for less of an age if you can justify.
If it's highly significant, if you can provide evidence that it has some great sense of significance.
And some communities do state in their ordinance that they're only gonna do designations for older properties. Like, you can decide, 50 years is still a little too young.
Well, I was surprised that it would be that young, but that's very beneficial in terms of flexibility. So that's something we should be aware of. The second question is the changes to a structure if it in fact is designated historic. Let's say I bought one of these houses that Jim is referring to, it's 800 square feet, it's on the river, or it's not on the river, but it would qualify because it was built in 1930. It's 800 square feet, it's cracker style, but 800 square feet is not large enough to accommodate my needs. Can we craft the ordinance that says I can expand the structure's envelope to 1,200 square feet? I can add a second story, provided it retains the architectural amenities, the design amenities of the original 800 square foot structure. Is that viable?
In short, yes. So the National Park Service has general guidance on doing rehabilitation to buildings called the Secretary of Interior Standards. So they have 10 standards. I think 2 of them apply to specifically additions and the proper way to undertake additions to historic buildings. They have to be set back from the roadway, and if you just took it away like a Lego, that the original building would be intact. So there are ways that we can adapt buildings to modern uses. That's the whole idea behind historic preservation, is we're not trying to keep everything the same. What we're trying to do is just manage the change so that we don't lose where we come from, right? So there are absolutely ways, and this is where those design guidelines come in handy, is because you have that, highly specific guidance already laid out for your town where, okay, this is how I need to undertake my addition so I can, expand my family while also retaining the historic nature of my building.
So as long as we retain the character, and we put it in our ordinance, so
Exactly.
we retain the character that would qualify for that structure to be historic, it can be expanded as long as those architectural features and such are retained in the expansion.
And this is something that your historic review board would look at. And so they would see the proposed plans and they would look and be like, I don't know, maybe it should be set back here, or no, this looks good. It follows all of our design guidelines. It adheres to the Secretary of Interior standards. And that's why we have this historic review board, is so everybody's on the same page and everything is interpreted consistently. And so they would oversee that.
In the back.
Yeah, on the National Historic Registry, when the applicant does it independently and fills out the forms and the paperwork, do they have architectural standards once they review that property that they come back and say, okay, we accept you into the program, but here's what we're gonna require of you for maintaining the building, future additions or whatever?
No. So the National Register of Historic Places is a list of properties that the federal government has determined to be worthy of preservation, but it does not regulate the property owner. The National Register was established in 1966 as a program to essentially regulate the federal government and the people it was either giving money to or issuing permits towards, or limiting what federal agencies could do. Because historic preservation here in the United States starts as a reaction to a lot of government funded, managed, and permitted work in post-World War II period. They're the ones, demolishing entire neighborhoods to build interstate highways or for urban redevelopment, and there's a backlash. And so that's how federal historic preservation is set up. So for example, here in Yankeetown, you guys actually have a National Register listed house, the Glass House. That was actually a really good project that we worked on. That was like, 3 or 4 years ago now that we listed that property. But in terms of the property owner, we don't tell them what to do with their property. They, if they've done work on that property, nobody's ever submitted anything to us, and we don't require that. We're not the preservation police in a way.
Right.
In the state of Florida, we have over 1,800 properties and historic districts listed on the National Register, with over 50,000 individual resources contained within those listings. And there's myself and 3 other staff people at the State Historic Preservation Office that are responsible for National Register and local historic preservation. It's impossible for us to police that. So in terms of physical preservation and direct impact upon property owners, the National Register is an honorary program. It's not going to directly impact them. It'll open some doors, like if you own a historic property that's listed on the National Register and you use it for an income generating purpose. You run your business out of a historic property, or you rent it out. There's tax benefits associated with that, where if you take that 800 square foot property that we're using as our hypothetical on River Drive, and let's say you rent that out to fishermen, the sports fishermen who come out, a couple times a year, you're gaining an income from that property. And let's say you do work on it to rehabilitate it, the roof, you're going to fix up the roof, and you're going to fix up the plaster inside and repair the windows and stuff. And that property's listed in the National Register. You could contact our office and apply for a federal historic preservation tax credit. We would confirm that the property is historic. We would review over the proposed work. And once we sign off on those 2 items, you would do the work, send us photos showing that you've done the work as you said you would. And then we would send all of that to the National Park Service. They'd sign off on it and send it to the IRS. And 20% of the money that you spend in fixing up that property and rehabilitating it, you can get that as a direct credit on your federal income taxes. And you would get that over a period of 5 years. Now, I know that that's not a direct check from the federal government, and it's not given at the front of the program, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the financial incentive programs are not designed to give money up front. They kind of reimburse you for a portion of the cost, but it does offset a bit of the cost of bringing a historic property back into use, which is one of our goals through historic preservation. Having a local historic preservation ordinance and a local designation program is also useful, because at the state level, the legislature back in the 1990s passed an enabling law that allows local governments, either cities or counties, to establish what are called tax abatement programs, where if you have a designated historic structure and you do work on that property, the property value increase that occurs because of the work that you've done, you can get a tax savings on that, where they will waive a portion of the new taxes that you would need to pay on that increased valuation for a period of time. And it varies. Different communities set different percentages, from 50 to 100% of that new valuation. They'll say that we're not going to tax you on that for 5, 10 years. It depends on how the counties or the cities do that. And that's another incentive for historic preservation that actually property owners can take advantage of. And the nice thing about the tax abatements is that it's not limited to income generating properties. You as a homeowner would be able to fix up a historic property, take advantage of that program, and save yourself a couple of $1,000s on your local taxes over time.
Hi, these questions are from Yankee Town Councilman St. John. Once the property is historical, will it always be that?
Up to the community. You can write into your ordinance a certain procedure for de-designating buildings. Generally, from our 80 certified local governments, that process follows the same process for designating the building. And they have to show some type of proof why it's not historic anymore. But that is totally up to the community to decide what process you want for de-designating a historic building.
And can the next owner opt out?
Up to you. A lot of these questions are up to you in your ordinance.
Well, these are just
So-
questions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so,
Well, okay, go ahead, you had.
so regarding the designation is tied to the property, not to the owner. So usually most places, once a property is listed, it stays listed unless something really changes about the property. And this is why we always encourage communities that are seeking local historic designation stuff to work with like your local realtors and stuff, because it's gonna be their job to let people know that they are gonna be buying a historic property. It shouldn't be a surprise to a property owner who's purchasing into a community that they have a historic property. The good thing about local ordinances is that, again, there's usually a process for rescission, the removal of historic designation. You would outline the procedures for that in your ordinance. And that's a crucial difference between local level designation and National Register designation. For the National Register of Historic Places program, because it's a federal program, we do all the paperwork at the state level, but ultimately it's managed by the federal government. Listing in the National Register is essentially permanent unless a resource is destroyed. And that's the only time that we remove properties from the National Register of Historic Places. And again, that designation is tied to the property.
Ruben, I just want to follow up on that just first, Jerry. So on the opt-out from a subsequent buyer, I assume that Larry consents to his property being designated as historic under our ordinance. It is so designated, he sells it, it's still historic. If that, am I correct that we really couldn't provide an automatic opt-out upon transfer of title? That person would have to request
It goes
to go
the
through the
process.
de-designation
Yeah,
process.
exactly, yeah.
And I assume that the de-designation process has to be something more than the people just want out.
Yes, it has to not retain its historic integrity or it's the architectural features that make it historic. It has to no longer have those things. It's, I mean, in short, like have an argument for it not being historic anymore.
And I would assume also, to try to make this realistic, so in some areas of town, we may foresee a day where a property simply becomes uninhabitable because of flooding. And I assume that at that point, you could probably provide that, yes, it could be de-designated so that they can remove it and build up.
Yeah, and that could be something that you would write into the ordinance where, you know, a lot of ordinances will have things in regards to provisions for economic hardship. You could potentially write something in where that the fact that it continually floods is an economic hardship, therefore its historic designation is a detriment to the property, and therefore, in order for the current owner to gain the return on a economic return on the property, then we have to remove designation. But you would write that into your ordinance, and you would want it to be objective so that you don't get this flip-flopping back and forth, right? Where people get designation and de-designate, but then you designate it again. You want some consistency and what's the word I'm thinking of?
Predictability.
Objectivity and predictability
Yeah.
to the process.
And that's part of, like Ruben touched on, working with the local realtors is so important. I I always say it this way, like, if you purchase a historic building in a historic neighborhood, you typically like the neighborhood, right? You enjoy the setting and where it's at. But if everybody could just do whatever they want to with their buildings and tear it down and build an ultra-modern building, then it's no longer the same neighborhood that you enjoyed, right? So it's really important that when people are looking for these houses, that they're made aware, and looking for these properties, that they're made aware of its historic nature.
he still have another question. Will it limit the number of insurance companies that will insure such historic structures?
So, unfortunately, we have run into some isolated cases where insurance companies misunderstand what historic designation means and the requirements associated with them, and it does have an impact upon a property owner in terms of their insurance. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that or not mention it. There are examples where we have spoken with people about designated properties. Now, usually it's in regards to the National Register of Historic Places program, but I could see a similar thing for local ones, and usually that's an education problem. The insurance agent is just unaware of what the requirements are. The common issue is that insurance companies think, certain ones who don't have a lot of experience with historic designation, they think that a property that is designated historic has to be brought back exactly how it was with the same exact materials as it was before the disaster that impacts the property that they're paying out a claim on, right? But that's not the case. And you would, like for us in the National Register, we say that the National Register program has absolutely no requirement whatsoever that the property has to be built back exactly how it was before a fire, a flood, a windstorm, a hurricane. There is no requirement like that because, again, we don't regulate what property owners do or do not do. And then at the local level, you could write that into your ordinance and into your design guidelines that if this property has been impacted by a disaster, you know, modern replacement materials are acceptable. You know, you could lay out some provisions on that would allay the concerns of insurance companies. Mm-hmm. But it tends to be just that there's a disconnect, a lack of awareness on their side, you know, them making certain assumptions about historic designation that are not necessarily true, and for that reason, they decide not to insure a property. And in those cases, I've always directed the property owners to speak with the Florida Insurance Commission. There's a commission set up at the state level that helps people when there are disputes with insurance companies, especially if you have a property that was insured, had been insured for decades, and then it gets a historic designation and suddenly, oh, because of that, nothing else has materially changed. The risks are all exactly the same, right? The property owner, you know, nothing else has changed except that there's this designation, and suddenly they're having insurance problems. And that's when I direct them to the insurance commission, because that should not happen, because we're not directly regulating them.
And let me follow up on that real quick, because the FEMA, to me, the FEMA 50% rule is such a driver of the benefits of this to Yankeetown. The FEMA rule specifically provides that if you qualify as a historic building and you renovate, rehabilitate, whatever in compliance with that, the building retains its pre-designation firm rating. So it won't change the firm rating, as I understand it, for the town or the specific site.
Yeah, and that's where you would speak with your local floodplain manager, because they're a lot more versed in the NFIP program, and because that's completely separate from the private insurance companies. So we saw a lot of hands.
I think the gentleman in the back's been waiting.
A couple questions, but before I ask the questions, I have a cottage in Ontario in a small town, and they have heritage property, a heritage property program, couple points, in how it works. They, have a property tax relief in the ordinance where designated heritage property owner will get about a 10 or 15% relief in the property taxes. So that's one thing for consideration. Also, the designation is renewable every 5 years instead of being without any termination date. It is renewable every 5 years, so the committee and the owner revisit the agreement and decide whether they want to go off for there. So that's something for consideration. So, question, based on that first point, will heritage property designation provide a tax incentive for people to apply for heritage property designation?
Let me see if I can answer this one, because we're all tax sensitive around here, and I think the answer is, it's up to the local community.
You're catching on.
Yeah, we can include, there is a specific provision under the enabling law in Florida that the local government can adopt a provision in its ordinance that provides tax benefits to designated properties, but the local government doesn't have to. So if the town of Inglis decides, we like this program, but we don't think it justifies a tax abatement or relief for owners, they don't have to give them one, but they can. So that will be an issue for our local governments if and when they adopt an ordinance.
I would like to add to that you can pass that ordinance if you are not designated as a certified local government. The review of that tax project is done at the state level. Now, if and when you are certified as a certified local government by Park Service, then that review is done at the community level. So keep that in mind. Oh goodness, ma'am in the back. I'm trying to go in order, so I apologize.
So two questions, and this one is one that's been hotly debated in our local meetings, and is to, is not, is to, is not. So I would like to put to bed forevermore from your lips. Does being a historic site exempt you from the 50% FEMA rule? Yes or no?
Well, let me read you
As,
what, no, they can clarify.
No, this is for these two. You have spoken.
FEMA's definition, to be considered a historic structure under FEMA's definition, it has to be designated as a historic structure. There's a few other criteria. Designated as a historic structure by a community that is certified by the federal government. In this case, a certified local government. Now, you could enact an ordinance and you could designate that building as historic. However, if you are not a certified local government, then that building does not qualify under FEMA's definition. So that's why becoming a certified local government is so important, and that's why I'm sure Mr. Haynes brought us here today, is because if you are not a certified local government, that designation does not impact the 50% rule. It has to fall under FEMA's definition as a historic building. Does that make sense? Or did I just confuse you a little bit more?
Well, you helped me understand why there's confusion among people in the same body, because it sounds like, yeah, kind of maybe.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at, but
Let me just follow up and quote from FEMA Unit 8, which is the guidance that all of your local building officials use when interpreting the 50%. And what it says is it lists exceptions to the basic rules for the 50% substantial improvement rules. And one of them, and this is a quote, historical structures are exempted from the substantial improvement requires subject to the criteria listed below. That criteria is it be a qualified historically designated property. If the improvements to a historic structure meet the criteria and are approved by the community, The building will not have to be elevated or flood-proofed. It can also retain its pre-firm flood insurance rating status. So, I am no expert on FEMA, but that seems as clear as made possible, that if you've got a historic building and you go into the town to make improvements and they say, now you're over 50% of the value of the building, then FEMA rules say that limitation does not apply.
So, I'm still on my question here. So from your lips, do you agree with what he says, with what he's saying? Is that a true and complete statement, or is there some other language somewhere else in that huge, enormous volume of words that says except for?
No, that FEMA provides four numbers for what they define as a historic structure. I think two of them have to do with, one has to be like recognized by the federal government, a national register property. That number 4 is.
Actually, I think the 4 is in the existing building code. I think FEMA is 3, existing building code has a 4th one.
But to be, if a local community designates a building as historic, they have to be a certified local government in order to be exempt from that rule. Now, if a community is not a certified local government and they designate a building, which is fine, but FEMA's rules apply. So basically, the reason being behind this is that being a certified local government is a certain level of expertise in historic preservation. So you have, individuals from the community that sit on the board, that oversee, they receive training from us and training that we can procure and things like that. So these communities are seen to have a little bit of expertise in historic preservation. That's why they're exempt from the rule, is because that level of review is then entrusted to the community because they have this track record of historic preservation already. Does that kind of make more sense? If they are not a certified local government, then FEMA's rules will still apply.
Yeah, so the guiding documentation is in the Unit 8 that FEMA has on substantial improvement and substantial damage. On page 25 of this document is specifically the guidance regarding historic structures, where it does say historic structures are exempted from the substantial improvement requirements. They do have 3 criteria that the project has to meet. The building must be a bona fide historic structure. So that's a structure designated either by the federal government through the National Historic Preservation, through the National Register of Historic National Register of Historic Places, or through the local designation by a certified program. The second criteria must be that the project must retain the historic status of the structure. So that they are not going to grant you a 50% exemption for historic property if you are going to essentially destroy most of the historic property through your project. Because then it's essentially classified as new construction. You got to meet all the requirements. The third criteria is that it doesn't exempt you from flood proofing your property.
That's key.
It says that you must take all possible flood damage reduction measures, things like elevating your mechanical systems so that they don't get damaged by the flood, or doing some basic flood proofing, like a lot of historic properties were originally built on raised up piers, right? So that there's space underneath, and at some time that space underneath may have been enclosed. That impedes the flow of water, and that can cause actually more damage when you want just water to flow around the building. So doing things like making modifications to allow water to flow through, or using water resistant interior materials where you're going to expect it to flood, but it'll be a lot easier to clean out and it will minimize the damage to the rest of the building. Those are different things for flood protection measures. The National Park Service actually has issued a set of guidelines for owners of historic properties, specifically dealing with flood mitigation and adaptation. There's an entire guide now, illustrated, that lets you know how you can do work to a historic property that will protect you against flooding and maintain your historic status, specifically so people could have an easier time working with FEMA. So, you know,
I never thought I'd get to do this, but I'm gonna make a slight correction to what Ruben just said. And I think this is probably because they probably don't focus as laser-like on the 50% rule as I do. You actually, as a historic structure, would be exempted from the flood proofing requirements, because that's a technical term under the building code. You are still required to use appropriate flood-resistant approaches.
But he
You know,
didn't
flood-
say required, he said you are permitted, right? Isn't that what you said? You're permitted to elevate your electronics.
No, but that's not even flood proofing under the code. You get into the weeds here, but flood proofing basically means you've got to have water resistant doors, like they have at Kane's Cattle Company, the restaurant down in Crystal River, where they've got those doors that fit into iron. They're basically submarine doors, so they can't flood. That is flood proofing. You aren't required to do that. You aren't required, most importantly, to elevate the structure, but you are required to do reasonable flood resistance.
yeah, it just says flood damage reduction measures.
Exactly.
It depends on the rating that you get, of where you are,
Mhm.
how much risk you're at, where you are granted, can your local community, if you're a certified local government, can provide variances on raising the home or structure to the base flood elevation. The requirements aren't as high for historic buildings, but for the 50% rule,
Mhm.
like I said, you have to be a certified local government designating the structure in order for that exemption to apply.
Can you define certified local government, please?
Absolutely. So I am the certified local government coordinator at the state level. Okay, so we have 80 certified local governments in the state, which is a lot. What this is a federal program that's designed to provide a partnership between the federal government, state level, and local communities in preservation. So in order to be a part of the program, there's certain things that the community needs to do. So number one is enacting a historic preservation ordinance, which we're working on now. That ordinance needs to meet certain criteria outlined in state law in order to qualify for the program. So that's step one. Step two, you're gonna appoint a historic preservation review commission. So someone that oversees this ordinance, so the changes to the building, someone needs to make sure that they're following it with the ordinance, right? That's step two. Step three is you're gonna fill out an application and send it to me. And then I'll review, make sure all of our boxes are checked, and then we send it to Park Service, and National Park Service is the one that certifies you. This is why that FEMA rule applies, is because Park Service, the federal government, is the one giving you the green light, the rubber stamp. They see all the paperwork. This community has special expertise in historic preservation, so we're gonna give you the green light, and then you're now part of the certified local government program. When that happens, you are entitled to special benefits. So training is one of those that we provide. We're actually going to Citrus County later today to provide that training. Technical assistance, pick up the phone and be like, I don't know what to do with this building. That's what we're there for, we can help you. Things like if you have your ad valorem tax review, you can review that at the local level. FEMA exemptions reviewed at the local level. So it's this special designation where historic preservation review, for the most part, is done at the local community. You also get special funding opportunities, so you can apply for a grant through our office, and our small matching grants go up to $50,000, and the community does not have to provide a match. So these are for projects like surveys, for writing design guidelines, for educational projects, for preservation plans, things like that. There are special benefits in terms of funding that become available once you're a certified local government.
Thank you.
So,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, it's a way for us to increase local participation and local control in historic preservation. Instead of everything that's happening at the state level, we essentially provide, or give the responsibility of certain programs to the local government. In exchange, the local government says, we accept these responsibilities, and we, the grants are a way to offset some of the costs associated with that, but it really allows the communities to really participate in that program, because this program, again, a little bit of history, was established in the early 1980s because there was a lot of complaints that historic preservation was too top-down. It was being mandated by the federal and state governments, and local governments felt that they did not have enough of a voice, enough of a way to participate and to advocate for their property owners and to make decisions regarding historic preservation. So that's the origin point of the Certified Local Government Program. And we're actually mandated by federal law to give at a minimum 10% of our federal appropriation that funds our office out as grants to the certified local governments. And so that's like a guaranteed $100,000, $120,000. But we don't limit ourselves to that amount. And what we do is that certified local governments apply for federal funds. There's a competitive process that's folded into the small matching grants program. And if you don't get federal funds, you can draw from our state pot that we have for small matching grants. The state legislature gives us like $1.5 million every year for small matching grants that certified local governments can pull out of to do surveys, design guidelines, of a great variety of projects. So.
And there was a second part to my hotly debated questions. The other subject of some debate, and based upon what you talked about a little bit with the historic district, I heard a term, what you're allowed to do and what you're recommended to do. So if we identify this historic district, and whoever this committee is goes around and starts putting X's on houses that they think should be historic in nature, and this voting thing that happens where you don't have to have 100% of the community say, yes, I want to be in a historic district. And let's say I vote no, but I'm 1 out of 100 people that votes no. What happens to my house and my ability to do things to my property? Am I subject to the rules that end up in this community-based guidelines?
If it passes and your home is designated as what we call contributing to that district, so, I mean, in layman's terms, it fits in architecturally with, you know, the rest of the area, then yes, it would.
Yeah, because essentially the historic district designation is like a form of zoning. So
Yeah.
just like you can't opt out of zoning established by the community that has been properly enacted by the city commission and properly gone through the planning commission that makes a recommendation to city commission, it's the same exact thing for historic designation. You're just essentially creating like an overlay district that says this specific area within this specific boundary consists of historic properties that should be subject to these designations, and that criteria would all be in your ordinance in regards to how to establish that district, and your design guidelines would state very clearly what is expected and what is not expected, and all of that has to be produced through a public process that involves the property owners who participate in local government. So that's essentially how the district would work. Individual designations are kind of like the same thing. It's almost like a form of spot zoning, where that one property that has been designated as historic, that's what triggers the regulations. And then, like I said, your ordinance would have a process to take those away, just like there's a process for changing zoning. That's the procedural governmental basis, essentially, of how historic designation fundamentally works in the state of Florida. It's essentially just a form of zoning.
All right, so let me follow up on that, because I think that's critical to a lot of the concerns
It
in town.
is, and we know your opinion.
No, you
I'm
don't
not
know,
there.
you don't know my opinion on this.
Oh, please.
So, can we do this? Because this gets to the heart of it. Could we designate, Riverside Drive we've talked about,
Yeah.
and has a long row of little Florida vernacular houses. Are we capable within our ordinance of designating a Riverside Drive district, identifying contributing structures within there, but not imposing historic preservation status or controls on any individual property until the property owner consents to that? So in effect, we create an overlay district that says, we want to facilitate the preservation of homes in here. We are going to establish these guidelines. They will apply to any identified contributing home that the owner opts in to provide. Can't do that?
Let me caveat that, you could do that,
Mhm.
but you would not be able to be certified as a certified local government if you do that.
So that would leave us, we would accomplish the same thing by just not creating districts.
You do not need
But
an overlay district.
you're subject to the
for
50%
individual
rule
houses.
then, because
No.
you're not certified by local government.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
yes.
No, you don't understand
I'm
it.
confused.
We could get certified as a local government, but limit our ability to designate only individual properties, not designate districts.
Your ordinance would have to have a way to designate districts. Now, it would only have to have that because our law for the certified local government program requires that your process for designation and your criteria for designation be consistent with that of the National Register. So that has to be in there for your ordinance to be acceptable to Park Service, right? They're gonna send it back to me if it doesn't. With that being said, even if it's in your ordinance, I have a handful of certified local governments that have, ways to designate a historic district, but don't have a historic district, and they just have individually designated properties. That's fine.
Because they
Yeah.
choose not to.
Because exactly, that's up to the community to decide. But if you have, in order to be consistent with that criteria, you cannot have an opt-in ordinance for a historic district. You should just designate them individually if you would, because that designation needs to have, I say teeth with it, but if you're designated as historic, then there needs to be something that befalls after that.
Can I say no, I don't want to be designated? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
that's
even-
why we
I'm
were-
not even talking about myself. I
Yeah.
have
Right,
my blockhouse.
that's why we encourage owner consent.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I wanted to clarify, you had mentioned about cities or municipalities that had a high percentage of second homeowners, I'm gonna call them.
Uh-huh.
The town of Yankeetown is somewhere between 60 and 65% second homes.
Mhm.
You did say that has been problematic because you cannot get all of the people to respond because
Well-
maybe they're not actively involved with it at home, maybe it's a family that inherited, or whatever the reasons are, they just don't respond.
So, the specific issue with that other community is that their ordinance is written where it says that for them to establish a local historic district, they have to have a minimum of a response, whether yay or nay, it doesn't matter, but 66%, 2/3 of the property owners must respond. And they haven't even hit half, because they'll send out letters and nobody responds back. And because there is no response, they can't move forward. So their problem is that in the old days, back when this program was originally established, and what I'm about to tell you, something that we do not recommend to do. But in the old days, the local governments, what they did is that instead of establishing local designations through local overlays, historic designations and such, what they did is that they basically said, anything that's listed in the National Register, we're gonna consider designated for our purposes and we're gonna regulate it. And we do not recommend that because the local government and the property owners don't have any involvement in the National Register after the designation is initially established. You know, after that, the state can go in, and we go in and we update those and we make changes and we reclassify things. And since the district's already established, the federal guidelines allow us to do that. And that can cause problems at the local level. And in this specific community, they have faced problems where their design review, which isn't intensive, but still exists, they primarily regulate demolitions. They, you know, if you want to demolish a property, you have to go before the preservation board to make sure that you're not destroying a historic resource. And then they can delay that demolition. But someone's been challenging them saying, you don't have a local designation, so therefore you can't regulate this. So therefore I can just go ahead and do whatever I want. And this is why they're trying to update their practices, right, to correct this expediency that had been established over 30 years ago, which at that time made sense and was accepted practice, but is no longer. You know, I tell every community, do not regulate National Register because it's not supposed to be regulatory on property owners. If you want to do that, you have to go through the public process that involves the property owners with local designation, because if you're going to put a restriction on them, you need to give them a voice, right? So that's the important thing. And so you all can choose to go down that route. You can decide, we want 100% owner buy-in, but just know that if sometime in the future you all decide that actually it is in our own best interest to establish a historic district, you are now going to need to follow that procedure that you've established in your historic preservation ordinance and meet those high requirements that you're establishing for yourselves. And it may be that suddenly, oh, we can't meet this, and then, well, we may need to amend the ordinance. Do you want to go through that political process again? You know, so it's a balancing act.
Ruben, let me ask you this,
Yeah.
because this is gonna be critical to this community, I think. So, we adopt an ordinance, it's gonna have to have a provision to establish historic districts. And so let's say we establish that it takes an 80% vote of of owners of contributing properties within that district to designate the district. All right, we do that. She owns a house in the district which is not a contributing property. What is the effect of being in the district on her property?
It's not regulated.
So that part of the answer is if you're not a contributing property, even if you're in the district, you're not regulated.
Yeah, I heard that, but I wasn't looking up for number one.
Oh, I know that.
I'm looking up for those people on Riverside Drive.
Yeah.
Honest, in all honesty, after, you know, seeing 80 communities do this,
Mhm.
for communities, you know, this size, individually designating is okay. And that's gonna serve your community very well for the purpose that you're seeking. However, should you seek, you know, you get a bunch of property owners together and they're like, yeah, we want a historic district, this looks really great, we wanna, you know, keep this character, then that's great, that's already in your ordinance, and that's something that you can choose to do. But there is no issue with individually designating properties.
You answered my question.
Yeah.
I wanted your expertise, and I
Yeah.
didn't get to ask you, but you answered the question.
Yeah.
For communities this size,
Yeah.
districts do not, it's gonna be very difficult. Secondly, you don't have staff to manage this stuff.
Yeah.
You don't
That
have people.
too, yeah.
You add layers of payroll to manage that versus doing individuals, and individuals fine.
And we want it to be a feel-good program.
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
not supposed, yeah.
We don't want, it's not, historic preservation isn't something to regulate, it's something that, you know, the community should be excited for, because we're, you know, we're exemplifying the things that make us who we are, like, what makes Inglis, what makes Yankeetown, you know, that's what's important here. So as long as those things are the ones that are designated, that's what's important. We're not trying to, you know, tell people what they can and can't do.
again, these guidelines or design criteria can be crafted in such a way, and, you know, and I'm just, you know, reaching out here because I may at some point get involved in this or attempt to. They can be crafted such that the primary visual part of the structure can be addressed, and not necessarily the back, or not necessarily the inside of the house.
Right,
correct?
typically, especially for a community this size, I would not recommend to you regulating the interior.
Yeah.
Right.
And there are Secretary of Interior standards that address adding things to the back, and usually, yeah, we wanna leave, you know, the sides that face the street,
Right.
you know, more or less intact, and there are ways to write those, and when you write those design guidelines, they need to be consistent with those standards.
Right.
You can't just go off and make up whatever standards you want, like,
Right.
you want them to be consistent with the federal guidelines,
Yeah.
Sure.
but with that being said, the federal guidelines are extremely, open-ended and provide solid general guidance, but that's why it's up to the community to make it specific towards your specific building types.
Yeah, and that's incredibly important what she just said there about the minimum standards established by the federal government, because that's what is expected for you to achieve your goal of getting relief from federal requirements through NFIP and FEMA. And that's what the federal government's gonna be looking at. They're gonna look at, do your designation standards basically coincide with National Register? They don't have to be exactly the same, but similar, that are applied in an objective manner and consistently, and that you do some sort of basic design review that is consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, because that's what FEMA is bound by as a federal agency. They are required by the National Historic Preservation Act that whenever they spend money helping a property owner fix up a building or helping a community do disaster recovery, they cannot pay for a project or work that will result in the destruction or the damage or harm to a historic property without some sort of mitigation. And mitigation is starting to get even more expensive. So what the federal agencies like to do is they like to avoid negatively impacting historic properties. And if they can get a list from the local government saying, these are all of our historic properties, we are certified and so, they know that, they know how to adjust those procedures and work with those property owners to get them the money that they need, but also comply with federal law. Yes.
And one last question that was kind of hotly discussed, spiritedly discussed.
That's her way of saying she thinks I lied to her.
Well, we have this, yes, nuh-uh, nuh-uh. So you guys are here to resolve the and uh-uhs in our meetings. So here's the statement that I would like to have confirmed by you. So I have a house in Waterways Estate, and I don't want to be told what to do with my property, so I say, no, thank you, I don't want to be individually designated. Then I have a big old flood, and it's like, hey, you know what? I think that's a fine idea. Now that I have a mess and I want to be exempt from the 50% rule to fix my house, can I opt in? And if I meet the requirements, can my my big local government here say, sure, absolutely.
Are you ready?
I think it's up to the local government. But this is a conceptual argument, because a lot of people innately say, well, it's sort of unfair that you don't participate in this program until you need it and there's a benefit. And my response has been, and I think fairly I've said, I'm not sure about this, but I think the proper response is, no, because the purpose of this program is to entice people to participate. And if enticing them means waiting till they see the need for it, we can do that.
My only concern would be, let's say you waited and you got impacted by that flood. The damage that flood caused to your property could have impacted it so much that it no longer objectively qualifies for historic designation, which is the door that you have to have open for you to take advantage of those programs. And once and this is specifically for historic integrity, right? The property's historic design, materials, and workmanship that go into it. Once that is lost, it cannot be recovered. Period. You know, and that is the number one reason I have to write no letters for people who are interested in historic designation in the state of Florida. That I say, yeah, your property looks like it has significance. Your church has been around since 1887, but because Hurricane X, Y, and Z required you to, you know, remove all of your historic siding, or you had to replace all of your historic windows, or you had to elevate your property and relocate it, I'm sorry, but you no longer meet our integrity requirements. You're no longer eligible for listing. I can offer you a historic marker, you know, so.
If it has Elvis on it, I'm in.
Yeah, but you know, that's the one thing. I'm not saying it's not possible, but you have to keep that in mind. So that's a risk you take, and you're free to choose to do that. We're not gonna go around imposing historic designation upon people that don't want to. I do not advocate for that. In the times that we get dragged into that, they're never fun, and it's usually just problem projects, and we try to avoid this as much as we can.
But you just mean after the fact,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you had a house that was destroyed, you could rebuild it as it was.
But
No,
then it would no longer qualify for being historic.
yeah, no, we could.
I think she's saying if it was designated historic in advance and then destroyed, can you rebuild it as it was?
It would no longer,
Yeah. So
Well,
you've
once
lost-
they qualify as historic, because none of the materials are
Yeah.
original.
Yeah, once a property is destroyed, it's gone.
Okay.
You know, it loses its historic designation.
What's the percentage of destroyed?
Destroyed means that there are no walls. There's
No walls?
No, yeah, we have, so usually
So if you've got one wall,
Well-
you're okay.
well, if you can walk inside of it and it's recognizable as a building, the issue, there is a gray, there's no line, right? It's gray. It depends on the amount of damage. It depends on how it was damaged. It depends on how many things have survived and what the, you know, the overall impact. I've listed properties whose condition is quite poor, all right, where it is unsafe to be inside the building. I've successfully listed a building as a historic property where I was walking on the roof while inside the building, all right? But
Yeah.
most of the building was still there. From the street, it still was readable as a building, as a contributing building. You know, usually the Park Service, and we draw the line when you have plants growing inside it, like a tree growing inside of a building, or if the walls are mostly knocked down and things like that. So it always depends. You know, we try to evaluate every building, every resource on a case-by-case basis. And it depends also on the history of the building. If the building has a significant history, we will try to do our best to argue for integrity and how that property is still significant. But if there's no real history there and the building does not retain its historic materials, design, and workmanship, then it's very difficult to argue that yes, that's a historic property.
But this is also where your historic review commission comes into play, is because they will review it and see, oh, we think with our expertise that this retains enough integrity. So therefore, we think this is historic.
Yeah, and that's valuable too, because you all in the community are most familiar with your history. You know what's most important, what events occurred there, how properties used to look like. And you will have greater access to that information and a greater ability to advocate for that. And therefore to do the historic designations that most accurately reflect the history and character of your community. It's much more difficult for us at the state level, all the way in Tallahassee, 3 hours away, and even more difficult still for the national government and our reviewer in Washington, D.C., where we have to prove so many things to them. So, Yeah, like so much stuff in the
Yeah.
list.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I had a couple things. One was, I think there's been some confusion on the requirement for flood insurance and when FEMA actually requires you. FEMA doesn't require you to get flood insurance, so.
Depends how close you are, or what risk they have you under.
But I would defer to the
That-
floodplain
yeah,
manager,
that's-
because they're the expert on all that.
Right.
But typically, it's the mortgage company that's requiring you to get the flood insurance. If you wanna have a house completely without insurance, you just don't qualify for any of the flood insurance
Right,
programs.
yeah, you're on your own.
About the percent buy-in for establishment of a district, you were saying that the ordinance has to address there being a possibility of a district,
Yes,
but you don't have to have the district. And you could say, okay, it's gonna take 100% buy-in by the current residents to establish a district in that area. And
you could. I don't recommend 100% buy-in. I think 50+1 works swimmingly
but
for
that
communities.
forces somebody that doesn't want to be in a district to then be in a district.
But you don't have to have a district. It's totally up to,
No, I
yeah,
understand.
yeah, it's totally up to you.
understand.
If you wanna have that
Yeah.
2/3 vote, that works great. But that, in order to be a certified local government and to get the
It
FEMA
just has to be
benefits,
in the ordinance.
it has to be in there.
Right. And then the third thing was, as far as, you touched on incentive or encouragement to keep the historical designation of a specific property. I've been in several situations where farmsteads up in Pennsylvania, where once you establish that farmstead, you get massive tax credits. One of the things here in Angus is that they don't like people getting tax credits. There's not enough people paying taxes as it is. But once the property does start getting tax credits, the incentive to keep those tax credits, or to keep the historical significance rather, is to say that if anybody wants to undesignate, they have to pay back all of those other back taxes on the property that were saved in the process of establishing the historical significance and keeping the historical significance. The farmsteads, it was a way of keeping 100-acre, 200-acre properties up in Pennsylvania to keep them from being developed in the future. And somebody couldn't just come in and say, okay, well, we're just gonna unlock a farmstead. If they unlock the farmstead, they have to pay back all the taxes that were saved. And that is the incentive to keep the farm and keep the farmstead going. I was just wondering if that's ever happened.
I've not, in the 80 communities, and Ruben's been here longer than I have, I've not seen that.
Yeah,
What percentage of the communities offer a tax benefit?
Around half.
Well, there would be the tax benefit, there'd also be the benefit as far as getting a grant to do some of the repairs.
well, so grants, at least here at the state level, our grants are only for nonprofits and local governments and some.
Oh, but not for the individual home.
Unfortunately not, just that's the way the state legislature has written the rules for the grants programs.
There are a lot
So
of private grants out there for historic properties.
there are a number, and I would recommend reaching out to the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. They're the primary nonprofit here in the state, and they should be aware of the various programs that would be available. And then that's really interesting about the tax repayment. I'm not familiar with any specific ordinance here in the state of Florida that has such a provision, but I can totally see that as a combination of carrot and stick approach to that incentive. I would recommend looking at the enabling law. Gosh, I wish I remember the citation off the top of my head that exists at the state level, and to make sure that it doesn't contravene or go against whatever's written into the state law.
I think it's for statute 112.
I forget. I'd have to look it up. And then, there was one other thing I was going to mention. Oh geez, it has slipped my mind. It'll probably come back to me a little bit later.
Can we do another question, what do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
FEMA is in the process of reviewing the subsidies for flood insurance. And one of the provisions that may change is that when I sell my property, my FEMA insurance rate is such and such. When I sell my property, the new property owner will have to probably pay at the higher rate without the subsidy. If my structure is designated historic structure, not as part of the district, because we don't have a district, but it's a specific structure, it's historic, I have a FEMA insurance rate. Two questions from just what may happen with that insurance rate? Will it be my current rate not lose its subsidy? Is it possible that my insurance rate that I currently have with the subsidy can transfer to the new owner because this is a historic structure? Does the insurance FEMA rate is attached to the structure, not to the owner? Is that correct?
This is a question for FEMA.
You understand?
Yeah,
But that's another
yeah.
incentive for us to look
Yes,
at,
all the above
because
possibilities.
it's very probable that a lot of our houses in Yankeetown are gonna, whether they lose the subsidy or not, when I go to sell my house, the new owner will probably pay more in flood insurance than the mortgage is worth. And so if we can protect that by designating these houses, the owner can protect the house by designating it historic, that is a tremendous financial advantage, and that's something we can go look into.
Yeah, I wish I understood flood insurance, I don't at all. It does, the FEMA rule does say that if it's historic, even though you don't elevate it, it retains its pre-firm flood insurance rating status. What does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah, we need to find out.
It doesn't, an insurance company can make their own decision. We choose not to insure. It's that simple. They can just say, sorry.
Yeah, try and get it mortgage.
Well, then you don't get
At
more.
the time of the sale, you have to lock insurance, bind insurance, flood insurance within a certain time frame to keep that designation. If you go beyond that, then you won't get that designation anymore. The new owner has the ability to keep that designation going if they bind insurance.
That may change with the new rules, but yeah, you don't need flood insurance if you don't
No,
have a
I mean,
mortgage.
Citrus County is going through it right now where flood elevations were raised 3 to 4 feet in areas. And all of a sudden, properties that weren't in the floodplain are now in the floodplain. And they're grandfathered in the old rate. And that rate will stay the same with the sale as long as they continue the insurance. If they drop the insurance, then it goes away. And then they pay the new rate.
I think we only have time for a couple more. I'm so sorry, but we do have.
If a property gets designated, is that designation filed with the courthouse so that a new buyer would have to be aware of it?
It
Because-
must be public record.
And it runs with the deeds, basically, okay?
It depends on how it's set up in the ordinance. A lot of communities, what they do is it's part of the zoning maps. So there's a historic designation overlay on the zoning instead of being with the deed. So it would be the responsibility of whoever's selling the property and stuff like that to notify whoever's purchasing the property that there's a historic designation on the property. Because that's again how designation is basically set up in the state of Florida as a form of zoning, instead of things being attached to the deeds specifically. And
So Larry, in all my years of doing real estate closings, I have never seen in a title commitment or in the public records a designation of the property as historic. So, again, you get back to, you have to almost rely on your realtors. We know people who buy homes aren't gonna go down and check the zoning map, they don't do that. I don't, you know, it might be worthwhile to play with the idea of putting in the ordinance that any owner who consents to having their property designated as historic will file a notice in the public records with the clerk of
Show up
court.
on the title search.
Yeah, and then it will show up on the title search, and nobody has any complaint if they aren't paying attention.
yeah, in some communities that participate in these designation programs are proactive, and what they'll do is they'll work with their local realtor association whenever they notice that there's a change in ownership through the property appraiser. the property appraiser sends a notice to the relevant community, and they'll send like a little postcard to the new owner saying, congratulations on the purchase of your new historic property. This is what this means, you know, to kind of introduce themselves from the very beginning. But not every community does that. I mean, that there's different ways, and that's a current topic of discussion within our professional circles and within the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, which is the national organization for local historic preservation, of how do you keep people aware of these designations and involve property owners, realtors, insurance agents, and getting everybody to buy in on this.
From a practical standpoint, you guys might be aware, there aren't many realtors out there that are gonna go out there and do it. The stuff I've seen locally over here over the years, yeah, it's not gonna happen.
Making those resources available on your town's website is a big help. Also, just having like a map there, you can't.
Oh, it's all good stuff,
You
yeah,
can lead a horse to water, right?
But also, I'd be careful about putting a burden on a local community, especially a small town, to keep track and send out postcards to new owners. The easiest thing would be, hey, you get a designation, it gets filed at the courthouse, and that way you know that they're gonna be notified. There's no excuses, basically.
Well,
Yeah.
that's how come we don't go around imposing local ordinances and certified local government designation on communities. The community has to apply and they have to buy in and say, yes, we're willing to take on this burden. So.
I'm gonna make this our last one, I'm so sorry.
One of the biggest warnings that you hear people in town talk about is that you don't want this. If a tree goes through your front windows, you have to replace your glass with, you know, hand-blown glass from Poland. You can't just have K&K glass come out and put in a new pane. Is that accurate?
You don't have to. Once again, referring to those federal Secretary of Interior standards, that you would rather repair than replace, but if there's nothing to repair, then you can replace, as long as those replacements are in kind with how it looked. And this is also where your own design guidelines come into play and where your historic review board comes into play. 'Cause
I'd
they're
like
gonna
to
review
add
that.
to that. I've been trying to get attention. It goes right along with that. I live over on Pamela Drive in Yankeetown, but I'm from Archer, and my church, Bethlehem Presbyterian Church, is on the National Register of Historic Places. And some wood had to be replaced on the church, and it had to be the exact age wood. We had to buy a barn in Tennessee, have it torn down, and bring it down to use to replace the wood.
But that was,
So-
who required that?
It was the National Register.
It wasn't us. Were you using a grant through our office?
No,
Did you use any other state funds?
not that I'm aware of.
So we would not have required that because we don't regulate how properties are repaired at all.
On the National Register.
When was this?
Within the last 2-3 years.
Does Archer have a historic preservation ordinance? Do they have a
No,
series?
it doesn't. They're looking at getting a historic district.
Now, I hear tons of stories like that, but it just seems contrary to the whole setup.
It's up to the community. They are not a certified local government. I don't know if they have an ordinance. I don't know if they have a board that oversees that ordinance. So they might, and that's the only reason that I can think of after the questions that would be required, is if the board required that of them.
Yeah, because for I manage the National Register program, and I have not reviewed anything from Archer. And even if somebody had approached me and said, hey, we need to do this work, I would have said, okay, you can do whatever work, replace what you need. I would not mandate that you go out and do that, because even where she said, in kind, we only are looking that it should match the appearance, proportions, shape. There is no requirement that says you have to match the material exactly. Because some materials are just impossible to obtain. There are houses that have asbestos tile in them. There's no way nowhere where you can obtain asbestos tile anymore. We wouldn't require a property owner to use asbestos again, even though that's what they used historically. You know, wood siding, yeah, it deteriorates over time. You know, we don't recommend you use vinyl, but you can use something modern like the concrete fiber boards or that type of stuff, or you can just use regular pine, you know, that as long as it matches the general appearance of the building. There are properties, like nationally level significant properties made out of masonry where the stone carvers nobody's trained to do that anymore. So what they've done is that they've scanned things like gargoyles and stuff 3D and made them out of fiberglass and coated them in like this textured paint and put that up on the building. That's not the same material, but that's an acceptable practice because it preserves the appearance and
I'll
stuff.
ask on that because
Yeah,
that's
'cause-
what we did.
Yeah, because that's a little concerning if somebody's going around saying that we mandated that when that's not what we would be doing. Unless there's a specific, like, if there was a grant through our office, and we do give grants to churches for exterior work, and there are requirements that they do have to meet under that program, but that's because they're using taxpayer money to pay for that repair, and there are certain standards associated with them. But if a property owner, whether it's an individual homeowner, a business owner, or an institutional owner, is using their own resources to do work on their National Register listed property, they don't have to clear anything through our office. They're free to maintain
Well,
that.
I see why they did.
Yeah.
So, I appreciate y'all coming, I know you need to go, we didn't really get to part 2, so I wanna tick through this real quick, which is the process of moving forward.
Mhm.
Would I be correct, step 1 is to prepare an ordinance?
Yes,
Step 2 would be to appoint a qualified board.
yes.
Step 3 would perhaps be to see if there's funding available from you all to help us do a survey.
Fill out an application and be a CLG first, and then do that.
Yeah.
But in your application, do specify that you're seeking CLG status to apply for funds for a
Survey.
survey.
Then we would do the survey and we could move forward from there.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you all coming, we've been waiting a long time for this.
Please send your ordinance to me
I will.
before it sees the city or the
Okay.
town, please.
Yeah.
Please.
All right.
It's a lot easier to do all the edits before it's gone through
Yeah.
reading 1, reading 2.
Well, and I have told people that I think the difficult part of the ordinance is the criteria that apply to our local community.
Yeah.
And so that takes some crafting.
And being open and involving your neighbors and the property owners is key, all right? You want to avoid, to the maximum extent possible, that this is something that's being done in secret or behind people's backs, or to impose things on people buy-in and people feeling like, yeah, no, this community is important to me, this is why I own property here, and therefore I want to do something to help maintain that community. That's what has to be done, because otherwise, you're not gonna have a successful program.
You have a model ordinance
Yes.
that we can use as a boilerplate, and
So-
we have access to
Yeah.
other
Absolutely.
ordinances that we
Yeah.
can use.
And there are similar small communities, you know, Micanopy, south of Gainesville it has their stuff. Bel Air is a little community north of St. Petersburg, that they've got one that's comparable in size. Monticello, outside of Tallahassee, they're, you know, right there where 19 and 90 intersect, they have their own thing. And you don't have to have super old resources, you don't have to have a ton of them. You just need to have the choice by the residents in the town that this is something that would be good for your community.
Has Tim spoken to you about our comprehensive plan and what's in our plan, and does it meet the requirements to move forward on this?
I have not discussed that with them. I can provide you the excerpts from our comprehensive plan. I think it is laden with provisions for actually specifically coordinating with you all, considering historic preservation. I think it has plenty of authorizing language, but, you know, we can make sure to the extent we need that.
Yeah, and that's good that it's in your comprehensive plan, because that will form a justification for moving forward. So, you know, if the community's already said that this is a priority for us, then you're just carrying out what the community's already established.
We just don't wanna have to address the comp plan issue if we're sufficient with what we currently have.
Yep.
Waterway stays, we have a lot of.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
You'll need to work with Tim Haynes and your local officials. They're the ones who invited us down here. So the community's in the driver's seat with this, so that's who I would work with. And then they'll be contacting us as well. All right, you're welcome.
Yes. Yeah, so some of those concrete buildings have like reveals and little, yeah. So if you all are curious on the way down to Cedar Key, just take a right out here and go down to half a mile. On the left will be one of the principal buildings in English. We say the old docks. And it is basically, it's right before we get to the nation. It's basically mostly a shed. But it was the ever, the facade of it, really kind of unique, just made of rock.
Your ordinance and your board, it's 4 times a year at a minimum.
When's your meeting?
And an annual report is submitted to our office, your activities. And that's basically it. It's very simple in the meetings. You don't have to have like, a ton of business. A lot of communities that don't like Bel Air, for example. They use their meetings to brainstorm, try to renovate the program. And that's what they do that. Or they'll do a public information. It's not all regulatory designation.
Board of Adjustment function as the review commission.
So the ordinance doesn't go away, but the certification will be revoked. We only remove certification for communities that have reviewed the ordinances. So you have 5 years here, now it's been certified.
As I understand, we can get waivers for that.
Yeah, exactly. As long as the ordinance stays on the
Mr.
books
Haynes?
and is carried out, most communities stay in good standing.
Like, for me
Yeah, they meet their needs, and that's important.